There is a clay tablet that has been sitting in the back catalog of a European university archive for over 100 years. It was excavated from the ruins of ancient Nippur in the 1890s, catalogued as K4192, and then essentially forgotten. Scholars flagged it as damaged, as ritual text, as too fragmentary to be useful. It stayed in a storage drawer for several decades. Nobody published it in full, nobody circulated photographs of it. And when a linguist named Dr. Ariel Voss finally got access to it in 2019 through a long-form archival request, she described her first reaction in her private notes as something close to disbelief. The tablet does not describe a god receiving offerings. It does not describe a king making war. It does not describe floods, or creation, or the underworld, in any way that matches what we already know. What tablet K4192 describes, in Sumerian cuneiform that Voss and her small team spent 4 years verifying, is a transaction. A formal exchange, an arrangement made between the Anunnaki and another group whose name in the original text translates, as literally as Sumerian allows, to the holders. And the item at the center of that transaction is Earth itself. Not resources taken from Earth. Not people taken from Earth. Earth as an object. Earth as something that could be handed over, registered, transferred in ownership. The tablet describes what the Anunnaki received in return. It describes the terms of the arrangement. It describes what category of thing a planet falls under in the accounting systems of whoever drew up this agreement. And it describes something about the humans who were already living here when the arrangement was made, something that was included in the terms but not in a way that benefits us. Voss published a preliminary summary in an academic journal that almost nobody reads. The journal had fewer than 300 subscribers. The article itself was 41 pages long, dense with transliteration tables, and it went almost completely unnoticed. She gave one interview to a podcast with a small audience, where she described the tablet as the most unsettling document she had encountered in 20 years of working with ancient Mesopotamian texts. Then the podcast episode was taken down. The host cited a technical issue. It was never re-uploaded. What you are about to hear is drawn from Voss's published summary, from the 4-year verification notes her team released through an independent academic repository before the university quietly restricted access, and from the tablet itself. The cuneiform is real. Voss's translation methodology has been independently verified. The tablet exists, and it says what it says. What it says is that someone made a decision about this planet a very long time ago, and the humans living here at the time were not the ones making it. The city of Nippur sat near the center of ancient Sumer, roughly where modern Iraq lies today. It was not a political capital. It was a sacred city, a place of temples and libraries and record-keeping on a scale that took archaeologists decades to begin to understand. The clay tablets found their number in the hundreds of thousands. Most are administrative records, grain counts, property transfers, legal agreements, but embedded in that enormous archive is a layer of text that deals with something else entirely. Texts about the Anunnaki, records about the origins of humanity, texts about decisions made in deep time that shaped the world we inherited. K4192 belongs to that deeper layer. Voss describes its physical condition as better than expected for its age, which he attributes to the tablet having been stored in a sealed container within the original excavation site, a container that itself bore a marking indicating restricted access, a marking that translates roughly as, for those with authority to open. Someone in ancient Nippur did not want this particular text read by just anyone. It was set aside deliberately. It was preserved deliberately. And then it was buried, and stayed buried for roughly 4,000 years, until the British-led excavations of the 1890s pulled it out of the ground and shipped it to Europe with thousands of other tablets, where it sat unread in a drawer for another century. The fact that it survived it all is remarkable. The fact that it says what it says is something else. Quick pause, and this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there's a second document. It's called the 7 Resets Every Time the World Was Erased, matched against K4192's trade terms, and the checklist of signs for the 8th 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That's all back to the video. The translation begins with what Voss calls the Preamble of Authority. This is the section of the tablet that establishes who is speaking and under what terms the document was created. In most Sumerian administrative texts, the Preamble of Authority names a king or a temple official. In K4192, it names the Anunnaki as a collective body and identifies the document as a record of a completed agreement. meaning the transaction had already happened by the time the tablet was inscribed. This was not a contract being drawn up. This was a receipt, a record made after the fact, confirming that something had already been transferred. Voss's team uses the label registration of completed exchange for this construction. The tablet opens by stating that what follows is the registered record of a completed exchange, witnessed by a body the text calls the overseers, and binding under the laws that govern such arrangements. That word, translated here as laws, is the Sumerian term mi, which appears throughout Sumerian religious and administrative literature and carries connotations of cosmic order, divine rule, and the fundamental principles by which existence is organized. The trade was not just legally binding in a human sense. It was binding in the same way that gravity is binding. It was registered against the architecture of how things are. The second section of the tablet identifies the parties. On one side, the Anunnaki. On the other side, a group named in the Cuneiform as the Dumu Kalam. Voss translates this as the children of the civilized land, though she notes in her verification papers that the translation is approximate and the term carries undertones of proprietorship, of those who build, those who establish, those who hold dominion over organized territory. The Dumu Kalam are not described in physical terms anywhere in the tablet. Their nature is not explained. They are simply named as the second party to the agreement, the way a deed of sale names a buyer without describing what the buyer looks like. What matters to the document is the transaction, not the biography of those involved. The third section is the one that stopped Voss's team for weeks. It names the object of the transaction, and it names it in terms that are not metaphorical, not allegorical, not symbolic in any interpretive sense. The object is identified using a term that in Sumerian refers to a celestial body, specifically a planet, specifically one that orbits the sun, specifically one that bears living matter on its surface. In the translation, Voss renders this as the inhabited turning world. The inhabited turning world was transferred from the Anunnaki to the Dumu Kalam as part of a registered, witnessed, binding agreement. Earth was the object being transferred. The fourth section describes the consideration. In any exchange, both parties give something. The Anunnaki gave Earth. What did they receive? This section of the tablet is where the text becomes most dense, most layered, and most difficult to parse according to Voss's notes. The term used for what the Anunnaki received translates most literally as the adonym. Voss spent the better part of a year on this term alone. The root components suggest something like a foundational gift, an origin substance, a thing that was present at the beginning and cannot be created again because it belongs to the first moment. She describes it cautiously in her published summary as an energetic or generative resource of cosmological significance, transferred from the Dumu Kalam to the Anunnaki in exchange for jurisdiction over Earth. What exactly the adonym is, the tablet does not explain in terms a modern reader can easily map onto known categories. Gold, it is not. Not land, not military alliance or political favor. The closest the text comes to a description is a phrase Voss renders as that which makes worlds begin, not that which makes worlds grow or prosper, that which makes them begin. The Anunnaki traded a living planet for the thing that starts the process of worlds coming into existence. Whether that means raw creative energy, a cosmological technology, a substance, or something with no equivalent in human experience, the tablet does not clarify. What it clarifies is that the Anunnaki considered this trade favorable. The fifth section of the tablet addresses something that most ancient transaction records would not think to include. It addresses the status of the existing inhabitants. By the time this arrangement was made, there were humans on Earth. The tablet acknowledges this explicitly. It refers to the humans present at the time of the transfer, using a phrase that Voss translates as the settled ones already in place, and it includes a clause about their status within the new arrangement. This clause is the part that has stayed with Voss since she first translated it. The settled ones already in place were included in the transfer, not as items to be moved or discarded. As part of the property, as part of what the Dumu Kalam now held jurisdiction over, the humans were part of the deal. Nobody consulted them, not warned, never informed, simply included, the way furniture is included when a house changes hands, or livestock is included when a farm transfers ownership. The clause about the settled ones is brief. It describes their continued presence as permitted and their existing function as maintained. Their function, what function humans were serving at the time, is not described in this section of the tablet. That detail appears later, and it is the part that makes the transaction suddenly feel less like ancient history and more like something that has not actually ended. The sixth section transitions to the witnessing body. The tablet names the overseers again here and lists a set of confirming terms, the Sumerian equivalent of notarial acknowledgement, formal verification that the agreement was complete and registered. Voss's team found this section remarkably well preserved, and notes that its legibility is actually higher than the more dramatic sections, which may be because this was the section someone was most careful to make permanent. Legal confirmation was the part that needed to last. Everything else could be damaged. The confirmation that it happened, that it was witnessed, that it was binding, that needed to survive. There is a detail in the 6th section that Voss returns to multiple times in her notes, almost as if she cannot quite leave it alone. The witnesses to the agreement are described as present in a specific kind of way, not physically present in a room. Present in a way the text describes as attending from the structure. Attending from the structure of what, the tablet does not say. But this phrasing, attending from the structure, appears elsewhere in Sumerian religious texts, in contexts that describe entities who exist outside the ordinary flow of time, who observe events without being subject to them, who are present at every moment simultaneously. Voss notes this without making a large claim about it. She simply notes it, because the language is consistent, and the consistency is interesting, and she is a careful scholar who knows when something deserves more attention than it is getting. Before we move on to the terms, stop for a second. What you just heard about the ownership transfer only makes full sense next to the 6 resets before it. The trade is binding, still active now. It's all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back, what's next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. The 7th section of the tablet is where Voss's team found themselves returning most often during their 4 years of verification work. This is the section that deals with terms. What was the Dumu Kalam agreeing to do and not do? What constraints came with the jurisdiction they had acquired? And what, specifically, was the ongoing function of the humans who were now, by the terms of the agreement, under a new authority without knowing it? The terms are organized in the tablet across 3 categories. Voss labels these in her translation: the rights of maintenance, the limits of interference, and the condition of continuance. Each category carries obligations on the part of the Dumu Kalam, and reflects the Anunnaki's apparent interest in certain ongoing processes continuing undisturbed. The rights of maintenance describe what the Dumu Kalam were permitted to do with their acquired property. They could observe. They could study. Samples could be taken from the inhabited world, the text specifies. A phrase Voss notes is among the more literal translations in the document. They could maintain presence in certain locations that the text describes as fixed observation points, locations that were already established before the transfer. These were not new installations. They were inherited. The Anunnaki had fixed observation points on Earth, and the Dumu Kalam acquired them as part of the transaction, the way security infrastructure transfers with a property. Voss's reading identifies the limits of interference as the section carrying the most legal weight. The Dumu Kalam agreed to specific restrictions on what they would not do. They would not alter the living patterns of the settled ones except within allowances specified elsewhere in the document. Removing resources from the inhabited turning world in quantities that would compromise the settled ones' resource base was also prohibited. They would not make themselves known to the settled ones in any manner that would, and here the text uses a phrase that Voss translates cautiously as disrupt the pattern of ordinary function. The settled ones needed to continue functioning in their ordinary way. Whatever that ordinary way served in the larger arrangement, it apparently needed to be protected. This clause in particular held Voss's attention for a long time. The restriction against making themselves known, against disrupting the pattern of ordinary function, implies something about why the settled ones needed to be kept unaware. It is not explained, but the fact that unawareness appears as a protected condition, something the new owners were contractually obligated to maintain, suggests that the ordinary functioning of humans depended on not knowing about the arrangement, whether because knowledge would change behavior, or because the function humans served required a specific psychological or social state, or for some other reason the tablet does not give. The Dumu Kalam agreed to preserve human ignorance as part of the terms. The condition of continuance addresses duration. How long was this arrangement meant to last? Duration of this kind resists easy translation into any modern human concept of time. The phrase Voss's team works with most is a construction that refers to cycles rather than years. Registration of the arrangement covered a duration described as until the completion of the current cycle and the settling of accounts that follows it. The settling of accounts? This phrase appears once in the main body of the tablet and then again in what Voss calls the coda, the closing lines. It implies that at some point the arrangement has an end, and accounting what was given is presumably Earth, or jurisdiction over it. The returned item presumably refers to whatever the adonym provided to the Anunnaki. What the weighing means, whether it implies a re-evaluation, a reclamation, a renegotiation, the tablet does not specify clearly. Voss's word for the overall tone of the closing lines is not neutral. It is the word expectant. The text of K 4192 ends expecting something. Voss raised this in her one interview before the podcast disappeared. She said what struck her most was not the premise of the transaction itself, strange as that premise is. What struck her was the grammar of the closing section. In Sumerian, there are grammatical distinctions between events that are over and events that are ongoing. The closing lines of K 4192 are written in a grammatical mode that refers to something still in process. The arrangement registered on this tablet, as of the time the closing lines were inscribed, was not complete. It was still running. Whether it is still running now is not something a clay tablet can answer. But the tablet does not describe a finished thing. It describes something currently in effect. The location of the fixed observation points is partially described in the 8th section of the tablet. Voss's team identified references to 4 specific geographic markers, all described in relative terms, oriented to celestial positions rather than to human settlements. Working backward from the celestial markers and cross-referencing with the known geography of the ancient Near East, the team identified approximate locations in 4 regions. One corresponds to an area of the Sinai Peninsula. Another corresponds to an elevated plateau region that Voss declines to specify more precisely in her published work, citing concerns about premature conclusions. One is in a coastal region she places somewhere along the eastern Mediterranean, and one is described in terms that match the general area of southern Mesopotamia, the region where Nippur itself is located. The fact that one of the fixed observation points appears to correspond to the vicinity of the city where this tablet was found and preserved is either coincidence or is not. Voss does not speculate on this. She lists it and moves on. The 9th section of the tablet addresses the category under which Earth falls in whatever system the Dumu Kalam used to organize their holdings. This is the part of the document that feels most alien, most foreign to any framework a modern reader can intuitively grasp. The text describes Earth as belonging to a category that Voss translates as a world under development, a world still forming its dominant pattern, a world whose final configuration has not yet settled. This is not a geological observation. The text is not saying that Earth's tectonic plates have not finished moving. It is describing something about the organized pattern of life and civilization on the planet. Earth was, in the Dumu Kalam's classification system, still in an early stage. Its dominant pattern was not set. The implication, and Voss is careful to call it an implication rather than a stated claim, is that the classification of a world changes over time. Worlds move from one category to another as their patterns develop. A world under development is presumably at some point no longer under development. What category comes after, what that transition involves, and whether it has bearing on the arranged terms, the tablet does not describe. But the existence of a developmental classification system implies that Earth was not unique in having one. There were, in whatever system the Dumu Kalam used, other worlds, other inhabited turning worlds, presumably in various stages of their own development. Earth was an entry in a catalog. The 10th section returns to the adonym. Voss describes this section as the most technically demanding to translate because it uses vocabulary that does not appear in other known Sumerian texts. The section discusses what the adonym enables, not what it is, but what it does. The effects it produces are described in language that suggests something like a generative field, something that initiates conditions under which matter begins to organize itself toward living forms. The phrase that appears most often in this section translates loosely as, where the adonym has been, worlds follow. Worlds, plural. The Anunnaki did not trade Earth for a one-time resource. They traded Earth for something that enables the creation of multiple new worlds. Whether those worlds are physical planets, something more abstract, or something the human conceptual vocabulary genuinely cannot contain, the text does not resolve. What it establishes is that the Anunnaki considered the adonym worth more than a living planet with established inhabitants and fixed infrastructure. In their calculus, the thing that starts worlds was worth more than a world already started. That assessment either reflects a wisdom about scale that humans have not reached, or it reflects something about what the Anunnaki intended to do next. The tablet is not a diary. It is a record. It does not explain the intentions of those involved any more than a sales receipt explains the plans of the buyer. The 11th section of the tablet describes a mechanism that Voss calls the compliance marker. The text indicates that at the time of the transfer, the Dumu Kalam placed something within the structure of the arrangement that would register deviation from the agreed terms. If the limits of interference were violated, if the pattern of ordinary human function was disrupted in ways beyond the agreed allowances, the compliance marker would register this. To whom it would register this? The tablet describes using the same term for the overseers who witnessed the original agreement. The witnesses who attend from the structure. Whatever registered a violation would be noticed by entities who observe from outside the ordinary flow of time. The implications of a compliance marker embedded in an arrangement that is apparently still in effect are something Voss declines to follow in her published work. She lists the section and translates it and adds one sentence, noting that the mechanism described would, if real, be ongoing. Then she moves on to the 12th section, without further comment on what it implies. The 12th section is the coda. It is the most damaged part of the tablet and the most briefly treated in Voss's summary. What her team recovered from the fragmented sections describes a final clause about reclamation. Under certain conditions, specified in terms too damaged to fully reconstruct, the original parties to the arrangement or their representatives retained the right to revisit the terms, to reopen the accounting, to reassess what was given and what was returned, and whether the conditions of the arrangement had been honored. Voss describes this clause with one observation. She notes that the trigger conditions for the reclamation clause, the ones that are still legible, involve a specific kind of change in the settled ones, a change in what the text calls their pattern of recognition of what is not specified in the surviving text. When humans begin to recognize something, something changes in the terms. That is what the legible portion of the 12th section says, and that is where the tablet ends,